Okay, welcome back to more Bloodborne Chalice Dungeon expansion painting. But today, this one, we are doing the Hunter Dog, which is this rabid-looking, crazy, spiked, gnarled beast. And we're starting off like we usually do with some clean water and a dirty water pot, some kitchen roll and a wet palette. And we're going to get that wet palette nice and soaked up, get a sheet put over the top of it, and to get rid of any wrinkles, use any sort of debit card, credit card, whatever card you got, to iron out all those kinks so you get a nice flat surface for all your paint mixing. Like I said, we are doing the Hunter Dog, so we're going to get him primed with some black and ready for some Zenithal highlighting. So to do some highlighting, I'm going to get a dirty mat that I don't care about, get my airbrush, get some thinner, get some cleaner, and get some ink for highlighting. I'm going to first pop in some thinner into the cup, pop in some Liquitex white ink, give it a blow back to get it all mixed up, a quick test to make sure it's running fine, and then we can pop our model on our little makeshift handle and then just start highlighting, making sure we're getting all the higher points brighter than the darker points underneath, making sure there's a nice fall off to the bright to the dark, and then that's how we get a nice Zenithal highlight job ready for some contrast paints to come on. So the first contrast paint I'm going to be popping on to this rabid beast will be some Skeleton Horde contrast paint. This is a very nice light kind of brown colour, great for skeletons, obviously, it's in the name. I also find it's really good for wraps, so all these kind of like little wraps that are on top of the dog, all these little horrible pieces of fabric and stuff, also good for ropes. I'm just going to get it nice and lathered up with this Skeleton Horde contrast paint. Also, making sure it's thinned out with either water or contrast medium means that you are still getting the colour, but you're not getting the same amount of density, meaning it's going to blend well with the nicer, brighter part of the Zenithal highlight, and also sink into all the little creases and nooks and crannies really, really well. Also, having the Skeleton Horde contrast paint on first allows us to then build up some darker tones underneath. It's easier to add on darker tones to bright than it is easier to add brighter tones onto dark. So the next colour we're going to use will be some Snakebite Leather, which is a lovely mid-brown tone, obviously used for leather tones, it's great for that, but I also find it's really good for fur. So all the main fur parts that aren't wraps or anything, I'm going to be using the Snakebite Leather on. It's going to be a really nice, good base coat to start with that we can add brighter and darker tones onto. Once we've had the Snakebite Leather added on, I'm going to use some darker brown contrast paint, which is going to be some Garagax Sewer. This is a really nice dark brown, and it's going to be great for our shadow regions, so I'm going to be painting from the sort of like pores up, making sure that all the darker points are all the lower points, and I'm not going over all of the Snakebite Leather, I'm just keeping that nice gradient between the two browns. Then I'm going to move on to some Iron Warriors, which will be our sort of gun metallic tone, and I'm going to be using that on this horrible weapon that the dog is holding with its mouth, basing all the parts that aren't the wraps, all the sort of sharp parts, obviously. And then once I have that done, I'm going to move on to do all of the protruding spikes that are sticking out from its back. It really is a horrible, horrible beast. So yeah, all of these spikes are just going to get a good coating of the metallic, and then also moving on to the little weapons that are attached to its feet as well. That's all going to get a nice basing of the Iron Warriors. Once we have those done, I'm going to be putting on some Fulgurite Copper, which is obviously a nice copper colour, and I sort of like to dab this around to give us a bit of, metal variation. It's kind of rusty, coppery kind of colour. It works really well, I think, with just general dark gun metal. Once that's done, I'm going to take some Moorcast Bone, which is a nice light beigey kind of tone, and this will be the sort of main mid kind of tone that will sit on top of the Skeleton Horde contrast paint on the wraps, making sure I'm not painting the entirety of the wraps, but I'm just painting those bits that are sort of more centralized, not the divots, not the creases or anything, the bits that are just sort of in the middle, and it can blend out nicely into the Skeleton Horde contrast paint, giving us that nice light to dark kind of gradient. And once we have the bone tone popped onto the wraps, I'm going to be using some Agrax Earthshade to wash over the wraps to give us even more sort of grime, dinge, contrast shading. It's a really lovely shader, and it will give us a lot of like grittiness to these wraps rather than just having them nice and clean. While we let that dry, I'm going to be popping some Storm Vermin Fur, which is this nice sort of greyy, browny kind of tone, I mean quite fur-like tone, onto random strands on the fur. I'm not the best at painting fur, but this is kind of usually how I go. You start using this colour on different strands, mixing in some whites into the Storm Vermin Fur to give us a bit of, variation within this grey. And then same kind of thing, I'm taking some Mournfang Brown, which is a sort of brighter mid-tone brown, and mixing those into different strands of furs, different hairs around, just to give us a bit of variation. So it's not all just like one cohesive colour, basically. And then once I have the brown applied, I'm going to be using some Zandri Dust, which is a very sort of like light sandy brown kind of colour. And I'm going to use this as kind of the highlight for the brown fur parts that we just did. So I'm just sort of targeting the edges of all the brown hairs. So then we have like a nice mix of the contrast paint underneath. We have the greys, the lighter greys, the browns, the sandy colours, all mixed around for this sort of gnarled fur kind of look. And then I'm going to use that same Zandri Dust as the brighter mid-tone for our wraps again. And then I'm going to take some Wraithbone, which is the brighter of the bone tones, and that's going to be our main source of bright highlight on the wraps. And I'm just using this at the very, very tippy tops of all the wraps and making sure that I'm just targeting the upper points and blending out nicely into all the darker tones that we have. From there, we're going to finish it off with my favourite coagulated blood. This is fantastic stuff from Green Stuff World, and I'm going to be just sort of dotting it around the wraps, sort of where these sort of spikes that are protruding, we can have some blood coming from them. We can put blood on the spikes, we can put some on the paws, on the mouth, on the weapon, anything where you want blood. It is a Bloodborne enemy, so, blood is kind of the name of the game. Just dot it around and you have a bloody hunter dog. Nice. So that is the second of many Chalice Dungeon expansion models that I am painting done. If you did enjoy today's episode, please be sure to drop it a like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you do feel so inclined to support the channel even further, I do have a Patreon. It's on the screen now and in the description, so you can join all this lovely group of people who are already currently supporting me. I thank you all very, very much. But in saying that, I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, and I will see you next time for even more Bloodborne content. And believe me, I've got a lot of models to get through. See you then.